Hello, my name is Jade Hadamio, and I'm going to be talking about a history of adult animation. Um, Through just quantity alone, somebody might get the impression that animation is and has always been a form geared towards children. That's not necessarily true. Since its inception, there's been a current of maturity in the form that was swept under the rug until a time when it would be brought back to the public eye. During the course of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about that history. In particular, I'm going to break it up, discuss it as broken up into three distinct eras. So the first era of adult animation, the second era, the third era, and finally, I want to talk a little bit about the appeal of adult animation. So the first era of adult animation is largely defined by the Hays Codes, what existed before the Hays Codes, during the Hays Codes, and eventually it's not necessarily decline, but it's erosion into just for children. So in 1918, Winsor McCay's animated film, The Sinking of the Lusitania, was recognized by the National Film Registry as the earliest animated documentary. Jazz Age animation studios often hired young animators fresh from their teen years. This might be a part of why early cartoons contain such juvenile humor but mature content such as scantily clad women and drug use. In the 1930s, what was actually known as the pre-code era showcased plenty of mature content in animation. So this was just before the Hays Code took effect. While the cartoons of the 20s were relatively tame, they still peddled largely in adult themes like sexuality, alcohol, and even marital difficulties. So the Hays Codes was named after William H. Hays, who was the president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America at the time. Officially named the Motion Picture Production Code, these guidelines were intended to help clean up the productions. The code prohibited profanity, suggestive nudity, graphic or realistic violence, sexual persuasions, and rape. It had rules around the use of crime, costume, dance, religion, nature, national sentiment, and morality. And according to the code, even within the limits of pure love or realistic love, certain facts have been regarded as outside the limits of safe presentation. So basically, this means we have a whole lot of married couples sleeping in separate beds for at least 20 years. Rampant scandals in Hollywood and other concerns about the content of pre-code films drew the states to draw up their own censorship guidelines, which ignited concerns in Hollywood about the government becoming involved. If you were curious about how this was allowed, a 1915 court case determined that motion pictures were not covered by free speech as they were perceived as business rather than art. Before the Hays Code, the MPPDA had don'ts and be carefuls, which acted as guidelines meant to diminish the negative attention on the films. Eventually, these would become the basis of the Hays Codes. In 1934, the Production Code Administration, the PCA, was created and required the approval of all Hollywood films by the administration before release. Eventually, the Hays Codes diminished by the 1950s and 60s and were abandoned entirely in 1968, and the MPPDA was renamed the MPAA, which established today's modern rating system. Here you can see just some examples of the Hays Code and what it kind of restricted. As you can see, seduction or rape, any kind of perversion, white slavery, miscegenation, dancing, just certain depictions of religion just were not allowed, or were disallowed by the Hays Code. So during the Hays Code, you can see just like a washing of certain characters. Characters like David Fleischer's famous Betty Boop were sanitized at the time, going from risque flapper to more conservative characterizations. And I will show a couple of those here. So. And next you can see the during Hays Code example of Betty Boop.
My sleepy. Oh, goodness gracious me. I forgot all about that mess last night. Oh, but was that a swell party? Oh, but this morning the cleaning. I've got those house cleaning blues. There's floors to scrub and windows to rub. I've got those house cleaning blues. So much to do.
So despite the cleansing of adult content that happened due to the codes, animation that played as shorts before films were still expected to appeal to audiences of both children and adults. Sophisticated humor, pop culture, and celebrity references, and casual comedic violence point to the impression that the cinematic animation of the day was not solely intended, if at all, for children. As television became more prominent in the replacing the cinema as the primary viewing medium in the 1950s and 60s, the voracious need for content in television saw old film shorts originally intended for general audience repurposed for broadcast during children's programming hours. The move to television also proved a detriment to film studios, which in turn had to slash their own animation departments. This led to cruder animation saving techniques such as what would be known as limited animation, which was popularized by Hanna-Barbera Studios. This format's limited movement, gestures, and stories were seen to have solidified the cartoon medium as being for children's Saturday cartoon. So in limited animation, animators would reuse large parts of the same frame over and over again, rather than having to redraw them. The result was cruder, less artistic than what would have been expected of, say, a bigger studio like Disney in previous decades. So there was some effort to appeal to adult audiences, such as Bob Clampett's Beanie and Cecil in 1961, but it would mark the end of any perception that animation could be for adults for the next 2 decades. Like a bright sun setting behind countless bowls of sugary cereal, television animation was about to sink into Saturday morning kidhood. For the next 20 years, the viewing public would hold the broad perception that cartoons were strictly for kids. After the Hays Codes were lifted, there existed an underground scene for adult animation, but they failed to broach the mainstream. The most commercially successful of these would be the 1972 Fritz the Cat, which became the first animated film to receive an X rating. As we move into the next one, we're going to move into the second era of adult animation. MTV was a major impact to this era. 24-hour television channels in the 1980s created demand for more content than ever before. MTV's first creative director, Fred Siebert, saw cartoons as the best visual analogy for rock and roll and started employing edgy animators to do the now famous interstitials. The 1991 anthology Liquid Television showcased animated shorts intended for adult audiences and would eventually birth the series Beavis and Butthead. This would also lead to the development of plenty of more animation for MTV. So according to Emily Rose Tobin, although not the first adult animated show to air on primetime television, The Simpsons had been credited with changing the media landscape and introducing the genre of adult animated television. Second to The Simpsons in its reputation for the emerging presence of adult animation is Comedy Central's South Park, which debuted in 1997. It earned about 980,000 viewers for its first episode. And since their inception, both shows are still running and have won numerous awards. Series such as The Simpsons and South Park pushed boundaries of what was considered acceptable for primetime content. This paved the way for the establishment of the adult-oriented network Adult Swim, which would pick up a notable portion of the 18 to 24-year-old male demographic, which was broadly leaving broadcast television, at the time. So following this, we move into the third era of adult animation. So with the Again, Emily Rose Tobin has stated, with the ability to binge watch episodes one after the other through a streaming platform, intense and complex storylines made more sense and were easier to tell. As networks such as MTV and Comedy Central, and even the fledgling Adult Swim pushed forward the developing genre of adult animation, streaming has led to a third era. Guided by current viewing habits, each notable streaming service has begun investing in new adult animated intellectual property, with the lead, Netflix, having 22 new series on order. John Evershed, head of High Concentrate and former CEO of Mondo Media, has dubbed this era the great adult animation boom, for the great proliferation of new adult geared animation series being produced. Here you can see some of the series. Mostly these are Netflix series that have seen relative success. Adult animation has entered a period of rapid growth and genre diversification. Streamers, broadcasters, and cablers have caught on. There are over 100 new adult animated series on order. That's a whopping 100% increase from a year ago. So just to address the appeal of adult animation is Dr. Toon Goodman. Again, mature animation was far more self-reflexive and contained more reference to the greater culture and media than children's shows. Shows that spawned a following by adults also tended to reference animated TV conventions of the past. At times, fondness ruled, but outright parody had its place as well. The third convention, one still in operation today, was the depiction of outrageous and taboo with little regard for taste. The medium has been shown to cross established demographics. The critical and reflexive nature of television shows that analyze and break down television norms creates a feeling of intelligence and depth that shows the viewers are then able to impress upon themselves. If what they're watching is smart, then so are they. The sense of empathy and affiliation with shows has even prompted research into whether they've been used as a means of coping with stress. Emily Rose Tobin examined whether through the common thread of self-deprecating humor, i.e. humorous materials where one comedically admits their own faults, focusing on stressors in a disparaging yet relatable manner, adult animated television series may actually create a positive coping environment for audiences. Although this was found to be inclusive, an interesting proposal of Tobin's was that the use of animated characters might allow viewers to relate to the stories and characters as they don't exist in real time and space. The medium has been shown across established demographic modalities to offer perceptive deconstruction of genre, challenging and complex portraits of mental health, and controversial illustrations of childhood, sexual, and social development. Another major draw, I suppose, of adult animation is just the aesthetic value. Animation lends itself to the stories that it can tell differently than live action media can. Animation can also be used to overcome the limitations of performance and censorship which plague live action shows. One notable example of that is Archer, which uses a familiar limited animation format, taking full advantage of the format to achieve greater economy of visual humor and style with a focus on complex dialogue and characterization, complemented by idiosyncratic intertextuality. Adding resonance to these interpersonal relationships are the cinematic flourishes used to underscore particular shots and scenes. Freed from the exigence of live production, animation allows for a more adventurous framing and shooting style than traditional television formats. Another major factor in the coming age of adult animation has been its move away from comedy. While animation suits comedy and lends itself to the form, there's a notable shift happening as adult animation matures and develops past just the comedic. John Evershed describes this era as the single largest shift in the history of adult animation since The Simpsons showed adult audiences that cartoons were more than just kids' content. Almost half of the upcoming animated TV series for adults are of the non-comedy genre. Again, according to Evershed, animated sitcoms are some of the most enduring and valuable franchises in the history of television. However, consumer acceptance of animation as a medium is widening to include new genres, including action, horror, and drama. Here you can see just a bit of a breakdown of what upcoming series as they're going to be, as they're requested by different production studios, networks, streaming services. And while comedy is still a large factor, fantasy, drama, sci-fi are growing in popularity and changing the face of adult animation. So again, John Evershed has said, for the last 10 years in a row, Adult Swim has ranked #1 among adults 18 to 34 years old in basic cable ratings across the total day. Most cable channels targeting 18 to 34-year-olds with scripted programming have ordered at least one adult animated series. Fox is the only broadcast network committed to adult animated comedy with 2 massive animation franchises, The Simpsons and Family Guy. Still, cable channels are facing an erosion in viewership, especially in young demographics, as streaming has grown in popularity, creating a shift in viewing preferences. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you for being in my presentation. It's been a very insightful experience learning so much about adult animation and the 3 notable eras that have defined it. And here are my references. Thank you again.
I heard that.